Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the last part of Book 4 from Caesar's de Bello Gallico on the AP curriculum. So this is chapter 35 and the first line of chapter 36. So we're not going to finish the entire invasion of Britain, but we're going to end the narrative here and move on to a different piece. At this point, you've gotten a good sense of what was happening in Britain, a good chunk of it. So you'll be all set. I would encourage you that if you want to learn more about it, I know it's not necessarily in the AP curriculum, but you should keep reading and kind of see how the rest of the story goes, just so you understand it for your own knowledge. But otherwise, like I said, if you're following along with AP, this is as far as you really need to go. Okay. So as we've been talking about at this point in the invasion, Caesar obviously got stuck. We had the storm. He's sent for help. He's been attacked. His foraging parties have been attacked. And the Britons really have him trapped. And we talked about how at this point, Caesar's gone over how the British tribes like to fight with their chariots. And so that unique style of warfare and how it really threw off his men in the beginning. But we've seen him adapting a little bit, right? And sort of adapting to this new tactic like he always does. So at this point in the story, we're going to pick it up with Caesar. He's fought off the British tribes, but they're still harassing him, and kind of the end of that narrative and how it all plays out. So like I always tell you in these videos, the first thing you want to do before you dive into the last piece here is just pre-read it for the vocab. You can find vocab lists, in things like Quizlet. There's a bunch of commentaries out there that have them as well. You just want to make sure that you have the words down, because it's really hard to understand what's going on and translate the Latin if you just don't know what the words mean. So always start there. The other thing you want to do is try to read the story aloud if you can, right? So if you're working in class, find someone you can read it to, read the story to them. They can read it back to you. That way you're working on your speaking, your pronunciation, and also your listening skills. Those are all really good tools to make sure that you're actually understanding the Latin. You never want to shut those off. The last thing that I encourage you to do is try the read and reread method, right? So instead of just reading through this or finding a translation and moving on, which I know is always the temptation in AP, to really deepen your understanding and actually learn this material, I'd encourage you to read through the story once, write down any problem areas you have, whether it's vocab, grammar, whatever it is. Then when you're done with that first read through, go back, look up your problem areas, right? If it's a word you didn't know, vocab, that's really easy, right? You can find any dictionary. There's a bunch online. Like I said, commentaries will help you with that. But there's a bunch of ways to understand what the words are. So that's pretty easy. If it's grammar, it's a little trickier. But again, this is where a commentary would help you through, right? A lot of that grammar gets marked. And just try to understand, what are you looking at? Is it subjunctive? Maybe that's throwing you off, or what exactly it is. Then go back and read through this chapter in a sentence, really. Read it again, right? And do the exact same thing and keep repeating it. You're looking to get to a point where you can read through this entire thing without any help at all, right? You understand it all. You don't need, anything on your list, vocab, grammar. If you can hit that point, you'll probably have a much deeper understanding, like I said, of the language and of the Latin, and you're ready to move on. And this way, you're not just memorizing it short term, because particularly if you're using this for AP Latin and taking the AP test, it's going to be a long pause probably between when you read this and when you take the test, and trying to remember what you did. It's just so much easier if you're actually putting in that time and work to learn this and really thoroughly learn it, as opposed to just memorizing a translation. Okay, so if you haven't done that yet, pause the video, go do it. Otherwise, keep moving forward, and we'll kind of go through it and pick up some of the problem areas and work through it together, okay? If you have any questions, like I always say, you can put some comments below. I'll help you. Your translation does not need to be perfect. This is just a guideline to kind of get you where you need to be. But as long as what you came up with is fairly in the region of what I did, you should probably feel pretty comfortable with it, okay? So the chapter starts like this. You have Caesar, etsi idem quod superioribus diebus acciderat fore videbat, ut si esset hostes pulsi, celeritate periculum effugerent, right? So there's a long line here that we're going to chunk out a little bit. So you have Caesar, and I actually didn't include the main verb in this part, right? So there's another verb you got to see in the next slide. But we have a couple of thoughts here. So you have Caesar, although, right? And you have idem quod, the same thing. Right, so you're saying, although the same thing had happened, right, which he videbat, right, is setting up an indirect statement here, right? So it's saying, although the same thing which on previous days, right, superioribus diebus, on previous days had happened, right, he saw that these things would happen. Fore here is really functioning as futurum esse, right? So would happen is the way you want to translate that. So again, it's saying, although he saw that the same thing which had happened on previous days would happen again, right? And it says ut here, namely that, and he's going to tell you what that is. This is all describing the thing that he's kind of preemptively seeing here. Namely that if the enemy pulsi essent, they were repulsed, they were driven back, right? Effugerant, they would flee the danger, the periculum, they would flee it, celeritate, with speed, right? They're going to run away. So what he's setting up here is that Caesar's noticing that because they're attacking in these hit and run style attacks, he knows that just like they did on previous days, right? Superioribus diebus. Just like what they had already done, they're probably going to do again. That's the fore, the forturum esse. So the idea is if he attacks them and they get repulsed, they're probably going to run away, right, and have him chase them. He knows this, and although he knows that, we're about to see what he does anyway. Okay, so you have tamen noctus equites circiter XXX, right, 30, quos comius atrebas, de quo ante dictum est, secum transportaverat, legiones in acie procastris constituit. Okay, so although he knew this, right, he had seen this, right, but he saw this. However, having obtained equites cavalry, circiter XXX, so around 30, so he's got 30 cavalry, which is not a great amount, but at least he has some, right? So this is worth noting. He finally has cavalry, which he has never had, sort of in this expedition to Britain, because they got delayed, right? So it's 30 cavalry, which quos, right? It's talking about the equites, which comius the atrebate, right, of the atrebate. So this is Commius, right? We've seen him before, which is what Caesar says here. De quo ante dictum est means which, or about whom, rather, it was said before, right? We've spoken about this person before. So Commius is this ally of Caesar, and if you remember, he's the one who had been held hostage, right? He was sent as an envoy, and the Britons had captured him and taken him as a hostage, and Caesar had negotiated his release as part of that original peace treaty, right? Before they started ambushing all these things. So Commius is back. So Commius is the one who transportaverat secum, who had transported with him the 30 cavalry, right? So it's saying Caesar noctus, right, having obtained 30 cavalry, which Commius the atrebate, right, or of the atrebates, about whom it was said before, had transported with him, had brought with him, right? So what does Caesar do? He constituit legiones. He drew up the legions in Achaea into a battle line, procastris, in front of the camp. So if you step back and look at this as one giant sentence, Caesar sees what's going to happen, right? He knows that the British are going to do the same thing which they had done before. And because of this, right, even though he knew, in spite of this, you might say, he still draws up his legions into battle, because now one thing that he has that he didn't before is these 30 cavalry, which Commius had brought with him, right? So he has a slightly different way of combating these hit and run tactics of the British. But again, Caesar's drawing up his army. He's going to fight them, okay, even though they have numerical advantage. Then you have commisso proeliod diutius nostrorum militum impetum hostes ferre non potuerunt, ac terga verterant. So with the battle having been commenced, right, commisso proeliod, having commenced, right, so with battle having started, right, the enemy, the hostes, non potuerant, they were not able to ferre, to bear, or to endure the impetum, right, the attack, the impetum, the attack of our soldiers, nostrorum militum, longer, right, so they were no longer able to bear the attack of the soldiers. So the Romans are getting the advantage over the British, okay? And so what do the British do? Just like Caesar predicted, they turned their terga, their backs, right? So in other words, it's a way of saying they retreated, right? So Caesar knew they were going to do this, and that's exactly what they do. Okay, so we'll talk about this later, but it's worth noting that Caesar is saying he knew what they were going to do in advance. It kind of, you want to think about it, and we'll talk about it at the end, but think about why he would write it this way and how it all kind of functions in the narrative when he says, hey, I knew they were going to do this, but I know they're going to run, they attack, and they actually do run, right? It's kind of an interesting sort of narrative that he's laying out here. Then we continue. You have quos tanto spatio secuti quantum cursu et virbus efficere potuerunt, complures ex eis occiderunt, dende omnibus rather, longe lateque aedificis incensis se in casta recaperunt. Okay, so we have sort of this long line to finish off chapter 35 here. So the quos there, you can translate as these, right? What it's really doing is it would probably mean whom, right, in this case, because it's talking about the British. So having pursued, secuti, having pursued whom, right? We're referring back to the Britons, but in English, it's easier to just go with these, right? For your translation. So you're saying, having pursued these, them, meaning the British, by tanto spatio, as great a space, So the tanto is going with the quantum here, right? Tanto quantum. So these are going to be the correlates here. So by as great a space or an interval as, right, quantum, as they were able, patuera, they were able to accomplish a right, with cursu et viribus, with speed and force, right, viribus. So in other words, they chase after, having done this, right, having chased after them with as great a sort of interval of space as they possibly could with their speed and their force, right? Occidera, they, meaning the Romans, they killed very many complures, very many of them, exeis, right? Very many from them, meaning the British. So they kill a bunch of the British tribes by chasing after them after they initially break. And remember, Caesar's cavalry would be the ones really leading this charge, okay? So then, after all this happens, you have the ablative absolute here with omnibus aedificis incensis, right? So then, with the buildings, the aedificis, with the buildings having been burned, longe lateque, so far and wide, right? With all the buildings having been burned far and wide, they recuperant se, they literally kind of took themselves back, or returned, you might say, returned themselves in castra, into camp. So the Romans line up, the legions line up, they face the Britons, they defeat them, right? As Caesar's putting it, they pretty easily handle them. They chase down as many of the Britons as they can, and then they do something interesting here. They go out burning all the buildings, right? And we'll talk about that again at the end, right? They burn as far and wide as they can. They burn the British buildings, and they come back to camp. Okay, so that's how you end chapter 35. And again, the AP curriculum takes the first line of chapter 36 because it kind of tidies up the narrative, or at least this chunk of it, rather, in sort of a clean way. So chapter 36 starts with this. You have eodem die legati ab hostibus misi ad Caesarem de pace venerunt. So on the same day, eodem die, right, on the same day as all this happens, legati, right, envoys, or sort of diplomats or messengers, diplomats or envoys is probably better. The envoys, having been sent by the enemy, right, misi ab hostibus, right, having been sent by the enemy to Caesar, right, they came, having been sent to Caesar de pace concerning peace, whenever they came. So on the same day, you could say envoys came, having been sent by the enemy to Caesar, concerning peace is another way of saying like about peace, with regards to peace, you might say, right? Because they're looking to make another peace treaty, right, now that this battle is ended and they've been defeated again. Okay, so now that you've worked your way through, and hopefully that made some sense, right? It's not the longest chapter in the world. There are some tricky parts, particularly at the beginning of the story, right? When you're dealing with that line that includes fore, which you might not know from unless you have a grammar commentary that it's futurum esse, it's functioning like that, and that phrasing is kind of odd. He saw the same thing which had happened, would happen, right? That's a little tricky, but the rest of it should be okay, right? Nothing too crazy. So some things you want to think about. Okay, so one is you want to notice his intuition and his generalship, his leadership here. So he tells you right in the beginning, he knew, or he saw, in his words, or understood what's going to happen before it actually happens. So this is interesting because there's two ways to take it. Do you believe him that he actually did that? Or is this him writing in hindsight saying, making himself look good, like, yeah, I was able to do this because I knew it was going to happen? I tend to think he probably did know what was happening, right? He's a very good general. We know this. So he probably did watch and say, hey, every time they attack us, they run away. So he knew that was going to happen. But he makes a decision anyway, which I think is important. And kind of the end of this sort of narrative that we're doing here is Caesar has figured out the British tactics, right? So he's probably going to be able to defeat them every time they meet again because he knows what they're going to do. It's just an interesting note to see there. The other thing, or the second thing, the cavalry is finally here, right? But it's not where you thought it was from. So the Roman cavalry isn't here. It comes from Commius. And again, remember who he is. He had been taken captive. Think about why he's there. Where did this cavalry come from, right? Commius shows up. He's the ally of Caesar. You'll see Commius plays into the narrative later on when he becomes the enemy of Caesar. But here he shows up. He's brought some cavalry. So it's just kind of lucky that Commius happened to be there and Caesar set him free. Now we see that kind of paying off as he shows up with his 30 cavalry here. The depiction of Caesar's men fighting the Britons is interesting. Right? So he's been telling you at the beginning of book 4, right? And kind of what we've covered in book 4, how great of the soldiers the British are, right? So it should seem a little odd to you that such great soldiers, they are defeated so easily against an inferior number of Romans. So the question is, did they really get defeated that easily? Or is that just a product of what we have, Caesar's account, in other words, right? He makes it seem like it was very easy. It's kind of tough to understand, but they were definitely had more men than the Romans. The numerically inferior Romans seemed to defeat them without too much trouble. okay? And you want to think about how this small detail is a payoff to previous descriptions. Again, if you're thinking about why Caesar might write this, he's been telling us this whole time how great of soldiers the British were. We obviously had the disaster and the beach landing, where we got to see that the British were very capable of defeating the Romans, or at least inflicting a lot of casualties, right? So the payoff is here. We've heard the British are pretty good, right, in fighting, and yet the Romans defeat them pretty handily. That speaks very highly to the Roman soldiers, which I think is kind of the point, right? You build up how great your enemy is, and then you have a chapter like this where you defeat them in short order without breaking too much of a sweat, and it makes you seem really awesome, right? That's kind of how it works. The strategy is also interesting. So the final deterrent against the Britons, you want to think about this. So they've been fighting them now for however many months they've been there, stuck in Britain, or in British territory rather, right? And they turned to basically like a slash and burn tactic, right? A scorched earth tactic, where the Romans go out and start burning everything far and wide. That's an interesting strategy, right? Because they're kind of stuck there, right? They need to get off the island. So burning all this stuff is kind of an odd move, unless you're thinking that like this is sort of a bit drastic, which I think it is, right? I think this is more of like a deterrent of, we don't want to keep getting harassed by these British. Let's just go out and make a statement. It feels to me like a statement at the end of chapter 35 when he starts burning everything down, okay? And then that first line in chapter 36, it's interesting because to me, I always read it as being very simple, right? We have all these complex different pieces of the narrative. When Caesar wants to be complex, he can be complex, right? In chapter 35, the beginning of this video, we saw a very long sentence to open it up. So when he wants to be complicated, he can. And then in 36, he starts with a very simple line. That same day, the envoys showed up and we made peace, right? What does the simplicity of that line suggest? It kind of feels like the British have given up and Caesar's won, right? Like, yeah, it's a matter of fact statement. Like, of course they did, right? We just smacked them. Of course they'd want to come and have some peace talks. But it's just kind of interesting how you have a very simple line to start chapter 36 when you've had some more complicated ones in the past. Not that chapter 35 is so complicated, but still it has a longer line. So again, think about what impact that has to start a chapter with such a simple, straight to the point line. That's probably very much on purpose. Okay. So like I said, if you have any questions on the translation below, or if I didn't explain anything clearly, feel free to put it in the comments and I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, keep at it. Use all the resources you can. There's a lot of good commentaries out there, vocab, practice it. And the more you read through it, I always say this, but the more you read through and practice, the better off you're going to be. And you'll get much better at reading through this and understanding Caesar's style, and being able to kind of lock it into your long-term memory. Right? You don't want to just read a translation, move on. Make sure you're reading it and understanding it and really comprehending it so you'll be ready if you are taking the AP test. Okay, so that's it for book 4 rather, right? We'll move on to the next one in the next part of the series. But again, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, keep at it and go.